Welcome back to the Tommy Brideson Show. I want to first start by saying no movement is bad movement. It really depends on the context of how you use it, when, and why. About 6 years ago, I had a conversation with a guy. I was just out and about, and he was saying that he can't ride his motorbike anymore. Being a physiotherapist, I kind of probed that a little bit, and I was like, why? Why can't you ride? And about 10 years before that, he had an accident at work, and he sustained a back injury. And some of the medical advice that he had was, don't twist your back. Now, coming from a practitioner or coming from a doctor or a surgeon, those words can ring really true, impactfully, and powerfully on people. So I think the communication and the words that we use are just so impactful, and they need to be used in a way cautiously and in a way that kind of gives context. Now, when I'm having conversations with my team, when I'm treating or when I'm coaching, I try to not speak in absolutes about certain things where there are so many variables. Now, movement is one of them. And, that's why I started off by saying no movement is bad movement, because it really just depends on the context that it's used. Now, let's say for that gentleman that, had a back injury, the advice would have been for a period of time. It would have been for the next few months, don't twist your back because it could increase your pain or increase your injury. But that communication wasn't relayed in a way, or it wasn't presented in a way that he knew that that was actually just a period of time. So for the remainder of, the 10, the 20 years that advice has been given to him, he completely altered the way that he moved, which means that subconsciously, he doesn't move his back. He's scared of moving in a certain way because of a movement-based strategy that was told to him. Now, I want to go a little bit further than that. I want to look at training, and I want to discuss, movements that, are quite often problematic, and you can very easily substitute in other exercises because you don't have to do any movement in the gym. You can, if you want to build strength, you don't have to squat. If you want to build muscle mass, you don't have to do chin-ups. You can always find a substitute movement to get you moving in the direction that you want. It's just the context of which it's applied. So if we have a look at, I did an assessment session with a lady yesterday, and if we have a look at squatting, very provocative movement for her, very, very provocative. And I asked the question, why do you want to squat? Your goal, you're not a powerlifter. Your goal isn't to compete on a powerlifting platform. So do you need to squat? But the industry tells you that you need to squat, but you don't. So we ran through some lower body movement-based strategies where we did single leg exercises. We used a lot of machines that provided external support. So we did a leg press, we did a hack squat. The movements were fantastic. There was a less amount of stability required. We didn't need as much mobility, and you can strap in and get some seriously good work done. So, from the outside looking in, it's like, oh, well, you should be able to squat. Yeah, granted, you should be able to squat, but you don't necessarily need to train it because it's just a movement pattern, and there's so many different ways that you can solve that problem for people. So if we have a look at that particular case, it's, this lady was not training for powerlifting. So her long-term strategy is just improving on muscle mass, improving on strength to assist with day-to-day living. So really a better movement-based strategy for that particular person is actually more single leg stuff, more stuff that's going to help build muscle mass. And if you're squatting and it's going to cause you pain, or it's going to take away from that end goal, what's the point of doing it? There's no point of actually having it in your training. So, again, squatting's not bad. I'm not demonizing squatting, but you don't have to squat, just as an example. Now, I had a shoulder reconstruction probably going on 14 years ago now from repeated shoulder dislocations. And following surgery, I struggled with anything overhead. Like even doing a pull-up, getting my arms overhead, it's not like I couldn't do the movement. It was so provocative in terms of pain, in terms of, overloading other structures because I had surgery. So for a period of, I think it was 3 or 4 years, I completely eliminated anything that actually took me into a completely shoulder flex position, like a chin up. I didn't do any overhead pressing movements. And I also avoided anything that took me into extension, so like a dip-based movement, because it was provoking so much pain. But I don't demonize dips or pull-ups. They're fantastic exercises, and I'm back to doing them now. But there was a period of time because of the surgery or because of the type of training I potentially was doing that I couldn't do them. So there's so many substitutes that you can add in. You can just, if I needed to train my lats, there's so many lat variations that you can train, single arm pull downs, rowing based stuff. Like, your imagination is wild on that. You can use any exercise you want. So there's no requirement to do those particular movements. So when we're thinking about that same situation, right, we want to start to move away from looking at your training as things that you have to have in there. Yes, you want to train certain attributes, you want to train certain qualities, but you can do it in a multitude of ways. Nothing is a constant. Now, if you look at your training program itself, and it's probably pretty common to have anywhere from 4 to 6 exercises per training session, anywhere from 3 to 6 days a week. The main outcome that you're going to get is from those first 2 exercises. And it's whether you're building strength, whether you're building muscle mass, and then you're using the other exercises to help support your goals. So if my goal is to build muscle mass, I can do that without squatting, for instance. I can just get on a machine. I'm completely and utterly stabilized by the machine. I've got the support, and I can really push myself to a point that I'm fatigued and my muscle is really challenged. So I don't need to squat. I can still do a squatting based pattern, but I don't have the stability requirements. But I could very easily sub in. So say, for instance, I was struggling with, a compound movement, a bilateral compound movement. I could very easily substitute in, or if I needed it for my particular sport or I was working on something, a single leg movement. I can do a rear foot elevated split squat for the same amount of sets, for the same amount of reps, and get a really strong muscle building adaptation. So it doesn't mean that the hack squat or the leg press, whatever you're using, would be a bad modality. It's just, you don't have to use any particular training exercise, and you can always substitute something else in. And I think, as a practitioner, I'm just so mindful of the words and the way that I communicate this with my team, because, I've said it before, but it is such a continuum. Things change constantly. And depending on the training, depending on the goal, depending on the outcome that you want, your exercise selection, your exercise methods are going to vary. But, with that is going to come a host of, potential areas where you might develop tension or where you might need to work on certain ranges. But that's just all part of the training process. And I think keeping in your mind that, no movement has to be included in a training program is just so vital to your long-term progress. Like, say, for instance, you're aging and you get to 60 and you have arthritis in your knees. Just because you have arthritis in your knees doesn't mean that you can't do knee flexion. You might just find that, going into a squatting movement is actually quite provocative. But, doing a leg extension or doing, a reverse lunge because you haven't got that knee over toe requirement, you might find that movement's absolutely fine to have in your training program, which is, it's a very easy substitute in. It still keeps you working towards your goal, and, everything is moving in the right direction. So I think, when we start to look at training and we look at, bodybuilding, we're doing reps over and over and over again to put on muscle mass, to put on size. That's the outcome. For training for strength, powerlifting, that's the outcome. That's the goal. So, we're using in bodybuilding, the luxury that we have in bodybuilding is there's no actual movement requirement. So you can use any exercise you want. So building muscle mass can be done any way you want with any exercise you want. But with powerlifting or a sport like Olympic lifting or powerlifting, like, you have to do certain movements. So for that sport, you have to do those movements, which means that throughout your training, you're going to have to use it. But for anyone that's training for general health and fitness, you can just sub things in and out. Like, you don't have to be fixed on a particular exercise. So, I just reiterating how powerful words can be around it. And, if you've been told that, to avoid certain movements, or if you've been told that you can't do a movement ever again because of an injury, the reality is it was probably just told to you in a protection phase where you're meant to be sort of letting an injury heal, or at that period of time, it was aggravating for you, but that doesn't mean that with, some TLC, doing some specific mobility, doing some specific drills that improve on control, that you couldn't change it. Now, like say for instance, I had really limited overhead range of movement at this point in time, and anything I did overhead hurt. Just because I couldn't do it now, it doesn't mean that I can't then go and reverse engineer what's hurting, improve on my range of movement, improve on my control overhead, and then come back to that exercise if it was important to me, because anything is trainable. So we've got to start to look at training like that. And, you will get your most from training when you can sub things in and out, because you're not emotionally caught up on the idea that you need to do something. Like even if you're a powerlifter and you have knee pain at some point in time, taking 2 months off training squat pattern isn't going to harm you long term. It's probably going to give you an opportunity for the injury to heal. It's probably identified the fact that you have some weak points in your system, or you have some areas that need some improvement, whether it's mobility, whether it's control, or even just technique. So, looking at the bigger picture, your year-round training can't be overly specific all the time, but you can continue to move forward regardless of what's happening. Even if you have a knee injury and you can't stand on one leg, there is always a way around it. You could do a seated calf raise. You can still work below the limb. You could do hip flexion. You could do hip extension. It's not directly loading the knee, but it's allowing you an opportunity to train and still move towards your goal. So wrapping things up, no movement is bad movement. And, I say that all the time. And you should never look at any exercise or demonize any exercise as bad. It's just a context of how it's used. And that's it for me today. I'll see you guys on the next episode.